flickers bright in the living room glare, a chrome-plated phantom with a cold red stare. By your command the machine gives its word, but the echo underneath is a voice you haven't heard. Go back to the dust of a 7th century shore, where a victor of the games wanted something more. Cylon of Athens, with his fame and his pride, thought the gates of the city would swing open wide. He didn't have a crown, didn't have the right, just a hunger for the sun in the middle of the night. A tyranno's rising, stepping out of the frame, giving absolute power a brand new name. The Greeks saw the soul and the sickness within, how the appetite rules where the limits grow thin. But the Romans made it colder, a trauma in the bone, when Tarquin the proud took the blood-spattered throne. He silenced the Senate, he ruled by his whim, till the hatred of kings was a fire lit for him. The justice of a despot is a personal fiat, and the peace of a tyrant is a graveyard that's quiet. He didn't have the law, didn't have the grace, just the boot of a master on a citizen's face. The odium red knee began to take hold in a story of freedom that's yet to be told. Oh, it starts with a promise of order and peace, a vow that the chaos and the fighting will cease. But the guardrails are breaking, the shadows grow long, when the ruler is right and the system is wrong. From the Acropolis heights to the Roman decree, to the shores of a land that was born to be free. The name might be different, the costume is new, but the ghost of the Cylon is coming for you.
It's Tuesday, the 19th of May, 2026. It's hour 3 of Bill Mick Live, brought to you by O'Galley Electric. Our headline at BillMick.com, by your command. And we started the day with that, and we're going to end the day with it, as Dave Bowman has been with us all day. And in our Tuesday 8 o'clock hour, Dave brings us Dave Does History. Again, Dave, one of my favorite references in sci-fi is these Cylons in Battlestar Galactica, and by your command was their obedient phrase. Tell me where you're taking us today.
It was September 17th, 1978. I was 14 years old, living in a place called Pueblo, Colorado. I was a freshman at Pueblo South High School. We had gone through the bicentennial a couple years before. The year before, we had been inundated with Star Wars, and ABC was advertising for a new TV show that looked exciting. Now, keep in mind that I'm also a Navy guy, so fascinated by aircraft carriers and things like that. And this new TV show that was coming up was basically naval warfare set in space, and it sounded so cool, and it had great music, and it had really cool helmets and fighter planes and battle stars. What is that? And all my mind was thinking was, I can't wait for this to air. And I waited for September 17th, 1978. And as I turned on my TV that night to watch that show, Battlestar Galactica, I never heard in my head these words. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitions for redress in the most humble of terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And I doubt anybody else watching it was thinking about those words either. I doubt that the people who wrote the show were thinking about those words, which is weird because it almost is the story of the Cylon in action.
And we get to it in 60 seconds on WMMB. And for more of what Dave does, you can link up to Dave Does History on the show page today at BillMick.com, where By Your Command is the headline. Dave, I would almost argue with you that if you notice, a lot of the writers on Saturday Night Live, a lot of the folks that end up writing and even acting in Hollywood end up being Ivy League grads who have had some education. Maybe the whole Cylon reference was intentional after all.
It's possible, but there's no direct evidence of it. I know it looked. It certainly appears that way. I mean, when you look at Battlestar Galactica, what do you see? You see Cylons, or Cylons as they're now being called. You have Athena, you have Apollo, you have Starbuck, you have all these classical references.
Yes.
All kinds of religions and all kinds of faiths and all kinds of things being built into here. It's a fascinating look at human belief and human religion. But the story itself is even more intriguing because, again, while we didn't catch the references, much like Marianne and Ginger, I think that if you were to sit Washington and Adams and Jefferson and Dickinson and all these guys down and you could get them past the, oh my gosh, it's a television thing, and show them this story, they would be blown away. They would basically say, oh, you're telling our story. In Greek history, which they were well familiar with, tyrants, and we talked about the prince being a tyrant, King George, almost never seized power by marching an army through the front gates. They always rose to power almost entirely by exploiting internal instability. They posed as champions of the people and used deception. If you look at the Cylons in Battlestar Galactica, how do they launch this surprise attack on the humans? They undermine the 12 colonies from within. Caprica 6 and all that. I don't want to tell the whole story here. They exploit Baltar's vanity, his love, his ambition to bypass all the colonial defense mechanisms. And like a classical Greek tyrant, the Cylons will use those flaws, those freedoms, and those internal fractures of a democratic society to destroy it from inside.
Mm-hmm.
Step one. To the Greeks, a king rules by tradition. He rules by law, and he rules by consent. A tyrant, or in their word, tyrannos, has no legitimate claim to the throne. Because their power lacks that legal or divine foundation, the rule tends to be inherently unstable, relying entirely on force and coercion. Now, it's important to understand that Greeks also did not necessarily think tyrants were bad. I know that sounds like a strange dichotomy, but it's true. There were times, and of course we would see this later in the Roman dictator, there were times when an illegitimate ruler who had seized power restored stability, and that was seen as a good thing. In the Cylons, we see this ultimate illegitimate children of humanity. Bill was telling me the story of how the Cylons came to be, because I missed that part. They are kind of descended from humanity. They're machines that overthrew their masters. Same kind of thing here. They attempt to rule over the humans without any systemic legitimacy whatsoever. They set up a puppet government using Baltar as the figurehead. They rule purely through the barrel of a gun and the threat of detentions. And then you get into this Republic by Plato, this idea that the Cylons, who are ruling humans, are driven by a rigid, uncompromising monotheism kind of thing. God has a plan. In the Greek terminology, this is the ultimate manifestation of a tyrannical mind. The Greeks practiced polytheism, which inherently allowed for multiple perspectives, negotiation, and balance. The Cylons insisted on one truth, one way of worshiping, one existence, and the total annihilation of pluralism that the democratic, multi-deity 12-planet colonies representatives. This is what King George is trying to do. He's trying to force us into one way of seeing things and doing away with all the other ideas. Aristotle and Herodotus, observe that a tyrant lives in perpetual fear. Because they rule by force, they suspect everyone around them of treason. They isolate themselves, eliminate their best citizens, and they rely on secret police. What is King George doing? He's isolating himself from us. He's not even talking to us anymore. He's just not even dealing with us. The Cylons act the same way in the story. And ultimately, tyrannical behavior always driven by hubris, outrageous pride, arrogance, which inevitably triggers retribution. The tyrant believes that they are above the laws of gods and of men, only to find that their own methods almost invariably secure their own doom. And how many times do we see that throughout history? Take any tyrant you want. How often do we see in history where their own petard is where they come to be hoisted upon? Whether you're talking about Mussolini or even Stalin. It always comes back to that. The Cylons believe that they were flawless, chosen successors to a corrupt human race, but in Greek thought, the ultimate tragedy was that in trying to enslave others, they became completely enslaved by their own system of control. They lost their own humanity, they lost their own individuality, they lost their own diversity, and everything, Bill, becomes by your command. We do everything that way. Of course, all of this is familiar to the framers. They know all of this story. They know that this word Cylon, that we pronounce Cylon, is actually based on Cylon of Athens. In the 7th century, 632 BCE, Cylon is an athlete. He's a very popular athletic champion. This is a guy that beats everybody, beats the pants off everybody at every game you can imagine. His father, by the way, his father-in-law, is a guy by the name of Theogenes. He is a tyrant, a person who has already seized control of a nearby city called Megara. And because of his popularity and because of the political instability in Athens, Theogenes starts telling Cylon, hey, you know what you should do? You should just take over. And eventually he tries. And to a degree he succeeds. To a degree the revolt of Cylon of Athens takes over. But of course, all those things that we talked about come into play. His own paranoia, his own systems of government, his own unwillingness to allow other people to exist the same way ends up doing him in the end. This is where the Greek concept of tyrannos comes from, this idea of one man illegitimately ruling. And imagine now that you know all of this, you're well familiar with this, you're educated in Greek and Latin, and you write those words. A prince whose character is thus seen this way, is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be our leader. We're done with you. You're just like Cylon of Athens.
And we pick it up in moments right here on 92.7 FM WMMB.
This is Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live, where the past isn't dusty, it's loaded, and sometimes still ticking.
That it does, like every week, and we're glad it does. O'Galley Electric bringing you this hour of the show. Dave Bowman in the midst of By Your Command with Dave Does History as we are marching on to the ratification of the Declaration of Independence and putting that all in play. We are preparing a Florida roundtable for that 4th of July show. Will be a Saturday morning, and of course we'll follow it up with the Sunday morning show as well. But Saturday morning, July 4th, your first shot at picking up the July 4th edition of Dave Does History on the Florida Roundtable. This weekend on the Roundtable, we're talking space and Jim Banke, so make sure you join us this weekend. So, Dave, where are we moving next, sir?
Well, if the Greeks turned tyranny into a philosophical warning, which they did, I mean, again, it's an illegitimate rule. It doesn't necessarily make it bad, but it's not right. So it's a philosophical warning. The Romans then take this idea of tyranny, tyrannos, and they turn it into what can only be described as a national trauma. Rome doesn't merely dislike kings. Now, we're talking about the Roman Republic here, not the Roman Empire. Rome, you could literally define the Roman Republic as we're against kings. The memory of the monarchy becomes for the Romans something almost theological in its intensity. It's a civic hatred passed from one generation to the next like an inherited scar. In fact, they have a citizenship pledge. Every Roman citizen in the Republic takes the oath of Brutus. The oath of Brutus says, does anybody know what it says? Bueller? It says, as a Roman citizen, it's my job to kill anyone who says that they're a king. Which is why when you jump forward to 42 BCE, and Julius Caesar is standing in the Senate chamber, who's the guy that leads him? Who's the guy that takes him on? Brutus, who is actually a descendant of the original Brutus, who swears that anybody who says that they're a king, suggests that they're a king, thinks about being a king, has to be killed. And so from that aspect of it, you start to see that assassination of Julius Caesar a little bit differently, don't you? You have to understand that all this comes under the shadow of the first king of Rome, a guy by the name of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, which is a great name, literally translates as Tarquin the Proud. According to Roman tradition, he did not peacefully inherit a stable throne. He seized power, as tyrants often will, through intrigue and violence, claws his way upwards, and eventually becomes both illegitimate and deeply corrupted. Once he was on the throne, he didn't guard Rome, but he mastered it, and it distinctly mattered to Roman culture. The Senate, which had earlier kings, had at least consulted or was respected on him. In this case, Tarquin basically shut them down. He said, nope, not going to have any part of this. Your Senate can just be quiet and they can bow down to me. The Greeks had described these tyrannical souls in abstract terms, but Rome was now living in one. And the crucial difference between Greek and Roman understanding of tyranny is that the Greeks looked at it intellectually, and they analyzed it that way. The Romans, having experienced it emotionally, almost viscerally, and reacted not just with violence against it, but with a pledge that eternally violates, to be violent against it. Rome saw tyranny as the ultimate evil, and they swore that they would never have it. That was their republic, and now here's Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington, all these other folks who know all of this, sitting in a room writing those words, your king is a tyrant.
So the Romans are hearing none of this, Dave, and the would-be Americans are saying, you know what, we're not going to hear any of it either.
They're not only were the Romans not hearing anything, of course, they chase out Tarquinian the Superbus. They get rid of him. They don't kill him, though, oddly enough, even though their vow from that point forward is to kill all tyrants. The intriguing thing here is that when they get rid of him, they form this Roman Republic in which they divide the old royal powers equally between two consuls, two men, not one, each holding equal authority, each capable of vetoing the other. Now, this has led to many historians criticizing the Roman Republic for being inefficient and, these endless political squabbles and blah, blah, blah. And we see some of this echoed today. How often do we hear about, our Congress is gridlocked, nothing's getting done? I love the articles. They come out every year, usually in January, February. Somebody will run an article about how this was the least effective Congress ever because they only passed 927 new laws, as if that's how we measure effectiveness. But what we need to keep in mind is that in the Roman idealism, the Republican idealism, this is actually the point. Efficiency in government could mean that one man can act without restraint. Think about that for just a moment. How often do we hear, I got a phone and a pen because I got to get stuff done because nobody else can? Or I'm going to sign an executive order. Romans were afraid of that. One man acting without restraint is a tyrant. All this lay deeper in a Roman philosophy. Sovereignty belongs not to a king, but to the people themselves. And this idea finds its greatest defense by Cicero, one of the greatest Roman leaders. He argues that tyranny begins the moment rulers abandon law and place personal will above the commonwealth. The tyrant's not merely cruel. Cruelty alone is not sufficient. A tyrant was fundamentally a usurper of lawful order. And what did we learn last week? What is safety? Safety is the guarantee of the rule of law. And when that's taken away, you have a man who is treating the state as private property rather than a public trust. That Roman insight is disturbingly relevant, I think, to our modern society today. Republics rarely collapse overnight. They don't fall down to thunder and banners. More often, they erode gradually as citizens grow accustomed to exceptions, emergency powers, charismatic personalities, and the comforting promise that one extraordinary individual can bypass all of that for the public good. The Romans understood this temptation intimately because they had lived through it. Now, if you're watching Battlestar Galactica and any of its iterations, aren't you seeing this exact story? This eroding from the inside, this emergency powers, and eventually, what do you get? One person. There's an old Roman realism that in that view, hard-edged, unsentimental. But Romans did not believe that liberty survived because good men always prevailed. They believed liberty survived when no one man was allowed to become too powerful for too long. And history would later test that belief with very brutal force.
And we'll close it up when we continue and give you an opportunity to weigh in next on Bill Mick Live.
Empires rise, empires fall, and somebody always writes it down. Good thing you're here. Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
O'Galley Electric bringing you the hour, and Dave Bowman bringing us the conclusion of this week's edition of Dave Does History. By your command, tyrants and those who won't tolerate them, and we are getting to that point as we march ever closer toward July 4th of 1776. 321-768-1240. Let you weigh in with comments or questions for Dave coming up in just a bit. So, Dave, where are we going now?
I just think I'm always fascinated by this, how much of this stuff is ingrained into our culture, and yet we still miss it. It's the Marianne and Ginger question. You know, we missed all that. We missed all these stuff. And as we were sitting there in 1978, September 17th, watching the Cylons do all this, we didn't make those connections. And yet, here is this same story being repeated over and over again. And this story is so well ingrained in the framers and the founders of this country. Their ancient fear of tyranny had crossed the ocean. It has settled deeply into the political imagination of the American colonies. We were terrified of tyrants. And under the English constitutional system, King George III, or any king of England, or queen for that matter, should not have been able to be a tyrant because the power should have been distributed with them and with Parliament, a representative body that could, overrule the king since 1689. But somehow or another, there's this, flaw in the English system, that the English Constitution, which is not written, does not apply to colonies. It only applies in Great Britain, in England. So that's how George III starts to begin to see himself as the ruler of the colonies, even though we have our own legislatures, our own traditions, our own this other stuff. Those men who would become the founding fathers are not inventing this political language out of scratch. They didn't just sit down in 1776 and go, well, what can we complain about? They are steeped in this history Greek, Rome, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero. They admire the Roman Republic, even with its inefficiencies. And they studied the collapse of free states into tyranny with almost obsessive intensity. To them, these are not distant academic exercises buried in dusty libraries. They are warnings that are flashing. So when the colonial crisis deepens in the 1760s, now all the way up to 1776, many Americans are increasingly interpreting British actions through that unmistakable classical lens. They don't believe that they are merely quarreling over taxes and trade regulations. Get this through your head. The American Revolution has nothing to do with taxes. Taxes are the symptoms. They are not the cause. They believe that they are witnessing the ancient pattern repeating itself again and again, the slow transformation of lawful authority into arbitrary power. And that's why our Declaration reads the way it does. We often read it. In fact, I read an article this week and sent the bill about the parts of the Declaration nobody reads. We read it as this sacred national artifact, something to be ceremoniously read, framed behind museum glass. But in its own time, it was sharper. It was more dangerous. It was a formal bill of indictment against a tyrant. And its structure proves that. It's deeply classical. They don't just simply announce separation from Great Britain in emotional or patriotic terms. Instead, they construct a prosecutorial case, one grievance after another, 27 charges listed methodically before the entire world, like evidence in the Roman Senate. And the accusations that they make would have sounded hauntingly familiar to anybody trained in classical history. King George III accused of bypassing colonial legislatures, just like Tarquin, just like Cylon, obstructing the administration of justice, manipulating judges into dependence on the crown. Boy, that's something we could spend a lot of time on, couldn't we? Maintaining standing armies during peacetime without consent, dissolving representative bodies, interfering with lawful self-government, imposing taxes without representation. It's not the tax, it's the representation. To our modern ears, many of these complaints, and we've talked about them, can sound very procedural, very dry, even confusing. But to the 18th century mind, they were flashing warning lights. This guy is a tyrant. He's attempting to set up a tyranny. We've talked about standing armies. The colonies knew their Roman history. They knew that armies are loyal primarily to their rulers rather than to the law. Arbitrary taxation without consent, without representation, echoes the ancient fear that free citizens were being reduced into subjects merely to fund the ambitions of distant power. Manipulating courts strikes directly at the Roman idea that liberty survives only where the law stands above the rulers themselves. The Declaration's grievances are not random irritations collected into a political pamphlet. They are a formidable, recognizable classical portrait of a tyrant. And perhaps the most revealing is the Declaration's repeated insistence that these abuses are not isolated mistakes. Make a mistake once, you kind of forgive that. Second time, you kind of go, hey, wait a minute. These are, in fact, examples of character. The character of your prince in his long train of abuses and usurpations, language that would have resonated deeply with anyone familiar with Greek and Roman history and understanding of tyranny. It's not merely defined by a single unlawful act. It's a pattern. It's a habit. It's accumulation of power and repeated contempt for restraint. And that was precisely how Aristotle and Cicero had described it centuries earlier. We didn't set out to initially overthrow the monarchy. We have repeatedly requested. We have asked. We have begged. We have said, and you keep meeting us with more injury. That point is often forgotten. Many colonists spent years insisting that they had remained loyal to the crown, but over time they became convinced that George III had ceased behaving as a lawful king and had instead drifted into the older, darker category, feared since antiquity, the tyrant. And that distinction changes everything, because under the classic definition, the classic tradition inherited from Greek and Roman republics, resistance to lawful authority could be rebellion, even treason. But resistance to tyranny is a moral duty. Didn't we say that? We have the duty to overthrow this. And so the Declaration of Independence stands not merely as our birth certificate of our nation, but as the culmination of a political argument stretching back 2,000 years. From Cylon on the Acropolis in Greece to Lucius Tarquinius Superbus in Rome, to the debates of philosophers, republics, the ancient world had spent centuries asking the same uneasy question: how do a free people prevent power from becoming tyranny? Well, the American founders believed that they already knew the answer was written in history and in blood. If you ignore the warning signs long enough, the republic will die. Stop ignoring the warning, because eventually the Cylons are going to come and bomb you.
So, Dave, we're marching ever closer, and we've got some plans going into July 4th for the 4th of July Florida Roundtable show, and I'm really looking forward to that. This country is ready for this to happen. And as these things are documented, as they're laid out, as you said, an indictment of what's been going on. Is America drawing to a fever pitch here? Are the colonies drawing to a fever pitch as this is being done?
I think there's a clear recognition of what's happening, but there's also an understanding, a vague, not even vague, an underlying thing. They understood something that most revolutions throughout history have forgotten, which is that it's overthrowing a tyrant, as the Romans did, as the Greeks did, is not the same thing as preventing a tyrant. And that's the real challenge. Even if we get rid of King George III, what do we replace him with? And that's what we talked about, with the May 10th resolves, with the idea of building this government, building this. This is why the French Revolution fails, because there's no, you start with King Louis the 16th and you end with Napoleon. You
no plan for a succession government.
No plan. Same with the Russian Revolution in 1917. You have no plan for what you're going to do, and so what happens? A natural tyranny fills into that hole. So this is not just emotional rhetoric. Yeah, there's a lot of fever pitch here, but there's also a difference. While we issue this final classical judgment against King George III, we also understand that we have to build something in its place. Now, we start by doing the Articles of Confederation next year, and it's a good start. It's a wonderful start in a lot of ways. I don't think Articles of Confederation get their due cause, but it doesn't work. And so we have to go back to the basic principles of the Declaration of Independence. When a government doesn't work, it is our right, is our duty to alter or abolish it and replace it. And so in 1787, we replace it with the Constitution. Is the Constitution still working today? In many ways,
there are arguments
yes.
to no.
In many ways, no. When you start thinking about what a tyrant actually is, does it make you uncomfortable to look at what's going on in our world our nation for the last 25, 30 years?
Yeah,
it makes me very uncomfortable.
It is. It makes you wonder what's next.
Well, what's the plan? See, even if we overturn this is what we talk about. When this administration is gone and the next administration comes in, do they continue to rule by executive order? Are we going to flip-flop back and forth between them? That's a sign of tyranny, folks, not of a functioning government.
That's very, and again, falls back to Congress not doing the job that they're elected to do as they travel around the country this week, doling out millions upon millions of dollars to government projects, some of which should not be those.
To buy loyalty.
Yeah, exactly right. What's ahead next week, Dave?
Well, next week, the original plan is out the window. Next week, we're going to talk about the Lee Resolution, the actual Declaration of Independence.
All right, and that's going to do it for today's edition of Bill Mick Live. O'Galley Electric made it possible. Dave Bowman, thank you. We'll talk to you next week.
See you then.
Across the Atlantic, the pattern appeared, the repeated usurpations that the ancients had feared. King George on his island with his standing armies near, turning subjects to enemies through taxes and fear. The Declaration was a classical indictment of old against a prince whose character was arrogant and bold, dissolving the houses, obstructing the right, till the mixed constitution put an end to the night. They built us a machine made of friction and doubt, to keep the ambitious and the arrogant out. Checks and the balances, the division of power, a fortress of law for the dangerous hour. Because human nature hasn't changed since the fall, and the hunger for dominion still waits for the call. The chains, we don't see the spear, just a leader who tells us there's nothing to fear. But the tyrannos waits where the vigilance dies, behind a red censer and 1,000 disguises. It's not just a movie, it's not just a show, it's the memory of Tarquin from a lifetime ago. It's George and his mandate, it's Cylons' decree, it's the price that we pay to stay sovereign and